Hello, my name's Jeremy Foltz with Red Stick Warrior Talks. Today we have Marilyn Vann with us, a guest of the descendants of Freedmen. Thanks so much for joining us today, Marilyn. Why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself?
It's really great to be here. Yes, I am Marilyn Vann, and I am the president of the Descendants of Freedmen of the Five Civilized Tribes Association. We are a nonprofit which started about 13 years ago, and we fight for the rights of the Freedmen people whose ancestors were listed as Freedmen tribal members on the Dawes rolls, which were made up about 110 years ago. Now, a little bit more about myself. I am a member of the Cherokee Nation of Oklahoma. My home community is in South Coffeyville, which is based in Nowata County. I am descended from Ryder Fields, a Cherokee Indian who came on the Trail of Tears to what's now eastern Oklahoma. And at one time he did live in what's now the Creek Nation.
So Marilyn, why don't you tell us a little bit about the connection and the history between the Freedmen and the Mvskoke people?
Okay. Well, actually, this connection started years and years ago. As most folks know, the colonies of the United States started out with slavery. And so you had runaway slaves that were going to what's now, for instance, say Florida, trying to escape slavery. And at that time, the Florida was owned by Spain. And so slaves that escaped there, if they became Catholics and swore allegiance to the king, the Spanish king, they gained freedom. And so these escaped slaves, they found freedom. They came to the tribes. They were welcomed there. And of course, at that time, for instance, say the Creek people, the Mvskoke people, there really wasn't a Creek nation per se. There really wasn't a Seminole nation per se, but you had different kinds of bands. And of course, you had people that were involved in clans at that time. Everybody had a clan. So occasionally some of these escaped slaves, they intermarried. Sometimes they were adopted into different clans or bands, but not necessarily. But they began to fight with the other people in the tribe as against the United States, which was determined to marginalize the tribes in sovereignty, try to force these black people back into slavery. And so when the United States began to say, come down to Florida, illegally invading the property that Spain claimed. Even the United States at that time was not claiming what's now Florida. The blacks fought side by side with the Mvskoke people. And you even had generals who said that the tribes were strengthened because of the blacks, who were willing to fight to the last man in order to not be drugged back into slavery. And even outside of Florida, you had the black people, these freed blacks or escaped slaves that were fighting against the United States, even as late, for instance, say, as the Red Stick War. Back there in 1814, you had people of African descent that were fighting against manifest destiny. What we now know as the Discovery Doctrine. So these were alliances of people who were stronger together than they were as people apart. So that was really the beginning, was mutual alliances of people that were being attacked by the United States, which, because more and more Europeans that were land hungry were coming here for quote unquote free land.
So let's talk about the rights of the freedmen. We're pre-removal. We're still in southeastern United States at this point, or around Florida, Georgia, and Alabama. What were the rights like for the freedmen?
Prior to the removal, you had people that were free blacks in both the Seminole Nation and the Creek Nation, Mvskoke Nation. And at that time, prior to the removal, you didn't have hard class lines, especially in the Seminole Nation. For instance, say you had Abraham. He was a prominent free black in the Seminole Nation. He was an interpreter. He even married a full-blood, quote-unquote full-blood, who was a widow of one of the Seminole chiefs, Micos. And the blacks, they were allowed to own property. They, people intermarried. People did not, really there was not such a look, there really was not a look down on someone because, well, they're black. You still had the opportunity to become a member of a clan, to be adopted into one of the bands of the Seminole Nation. And so things, again, until the removal, were fairly fluid. Things were a little bit harder in the Creek Nation because you had a bigger percentage of intermarried whites or the descendants of whites who had married into the Creek Nation. And of course, these were some of the leading families, for instance, say the McIntoshes. The first one who always comes to mind, for instance, say, is William McIntosh, who was a big slave owner in the Creek Nation, town king of Coweta. There were other leading families that were slaveholders, the Hawkins family, your Marshall family, there were others. But even in the Creek Nation, prior to removal, there were some intermarriage with free blacks. There were not laws against education or property owning, for instance, say of weapons and things like that. There wasn't as much mobility in the Creek Nation as in the Seminole Nation, but there still was some. And there were people who were recognized as citizens of the Creek Nation. People who had been adopted into a clan, into a tribal town, who were of known African descent. And of course, these people, whether they were known as citizens or whether they were free blacks legally living in the Creek Nation, they also spoke Creek. This was their nation. The foods of the Mvskoke people, Sofke, this was their food. They knew nothing about private land because that was an American concept. This idea here, and sometimes you hear people saying, oh, these African Americans who came to the Creek Nation or came to the Seminole Nation. Well, these people were not African Americans. They didn't have U.S. citizenship until the 20th century, when other people that were Creeks or Seminoles, they received U.S. citizenship. So as I said, the mentality, the culture, the language of those people was of the Mvskoke people. And that is, you had some people, again, like I said, Abraham, who were interpreters. There were some people, I think down in the, there was another, you also had some people like Cow Tom, Harry Island, some other folks. Of course, these became more prominent after the removal. But there was a place in the nations of the Mvskoke people for free black people prior to the removal, not only as slaves, but people who had a place, who brought things to the nation besides just labor.
So we're in the southeastern United States at this point geographically. Prior to the removal, we are forced now to Indian Territory. The Freedmen were in that Trail of Tears with the Creek people. Is that correct?
That is correct. When the tribes were forced out, the blacks, both those who were enslaved as well as those that were free blacks, were forced out also. The French say in the Creek Nation, everybody had to make that hard trail. The same thing with Seminole Nation. And the unfortunate thing, of course, is that you had whites who were trying to seize blacks and force them to come to Georgia or other places. Well, they may already have been in Georgia, but they were trying to keep people from, say, leaving Georgia or leaving Alabama or other places, people that were whites who were saying, well, these are our slaves. And in some instances, they were able to steal people, free blacks, and keep them east of the Mississippi. In some cases, they were not able to do that. In some instances, you might, for instance, say, have a Seminole Indian who might have said, in order to keep this black from being removed, back into some white man's slave cabin, and they might say, well, no, this is my slave. And not that they really saw the person as their slave, but they were trying to protect that person so that they would be able to leave with the rest of the tribe. So yes, the story of the Trail of Tears is also the story of the freedmen of the Mvskoke people. All the hardships, the freezing, the hunger, the cold, the death and the dying. It's just that some of the stories have not been told because a lot of the blacks, they couldn't read or write to tell their story, or there was nobody to publish their story in the book.
So Marilyn, with the Freedmen and the Mvskoke people on the Trail of Tears coming to Indian Territory, what happened to the relationship?
The relationships got worse, especially in the Creek Nation. For one thing, there was pressure that was coming on the nations, and including the blacks in the nations, because you had all of these white people coming in here from Arkansas, Missouri, wherever, and they were seizing free blacks, carrying them off, or trying to, and pretending that these were their slaves, and so your blacks in the Indian nations were always having to fight against this kind of an outside aggression. In the Creek Nation, one of the reasons that the free blacks had a harder problem is that, and also the slaves, is that there was a hardening of attitudes. You had, more so in the Creek Nation than the Seminole Nation, you had your intermarried whites that came to the Creek Nation for opportunity, and they were building businesses. They were becoming store owners, traders. They were building plantations. Their sons and daughters were inheriting these plantations. They were bringing Deep South attitudes with them, and their children, again, who were mixed mixed, quote unquote, mixed bloods, mixed breeds. And we're talking again about families such as the McIntoshes, Marshalls, some other families like this, Hawkins, some of the Graysons. You were having some intermarried whites. So as I said, laws began to be passed by the National Council that dealing, for instance, say with restricting marriages between Creek citizens and, say, free blacks. Certainly, slaves didn't have the right to legally marry. But so you had those kinds of laws against adopting free blacks into the tribal towns or into clans. You also had laws against free blacks owning weapons, other types of property. These kinds of some of the kinds of slave codes or black codes that you found in the Deep South were coming into the Creek Nation. Now, and it's possible that the majority of people, if a complete head count had been made, maybe everybody didn't necessarily agree with those. But the people who were becoming the leaders of the Creek Nation were these mixed blood families. Because these people were better educated, they were more savvy, they began to, owning a lot of property, lives of leisure. These kinds of things became important. They began to forget about traditional values. Whereas, prior to the removal, you didn't have those hard lines. But as I said, you started having these hard lines. In the Seminole Nation, the lines never got as hard as they were in the Creek Nation. There was never a law in the Seminole Nation that, say, one of the free blacks there could not marry within the tribe, or own a weapon, or or be educated. There were some educated free blacks prior to the Civil War in the Seminole Nation. Again, you had some of your interpreters in the Seminole Nation who were well respected, but as I said, things got worse for your free blacks, and even in the Seminole Nation, which a lot of the pressure was coming from these whites sneaking in, trying to drag people out. You had some blacks that just left the nation, and the main situation that comes to mind is when you had John Horse, one of the more prominent free blacks, a leader of his people, who left with Wildcat, and they went to Mexico and lived there for several years. Some of the free blacks, they eventually left Mexico. Some stayed in Texas, but others did come back to what is now the Seminole Nation. So unfortunately, things got worse. The unity that had been there between the Mvskoke people and the Freedmen / free blacks was not the same as prior to the removal.
And so at what point, I've noticed in the history of the Mvskoke people and specifically the Creek Nation, freedmen were giving allotments. How did that come about?
Okay. This is all happening after the Civil War, when the treaties, after the treaties were signed by the Creek Nation and the in the United States. As some of you all may know, the Creek Nation, the 5 tribes, all 5, including the Seminole Nation and the Creek Nation, signed treaties with the Confederate States in 1861. A large part of that was that the leadership of those tribes, or the most prominent leaders, they were slave owners. And you had leaders, military leaders from the South, that they promised these people, well, if you throw your lot in with us, we'll always have permanent slavery. The Northern leadership, of the United States, they're looking more toward abolishing or limiting slavery. And so this is a big part of the reason that you had your Southern, that these leaders in the nations, they threw their lot in with the Confederacy. It wasn't the whole thing. There were some other things. They were going to have more sovereignty. The 5 tribes were going to have seats in the Confederate Senate. But as I said, slavery and the profits that were available to them, they wanted to continue. So the majority of the leadership in the 2 tribes, they held for the South. They set up units, battalions for the South. Now, not completely. You had some leaders that fought with the North in the Indian Home Guards. You had some people, for instance, say Obethiolahola, sorry for mispronouncing his name, Gouge, who fought with the United States. They said, we want to hold with the old treaties. You also you had some leadership in the Seminole Nation that also did not want to break ties with the United States. They thought it would be better for the nation. John Chupko, he was one of the main Seminole leaders who fought with the Union, with the United States. And of course, there were freedmen that fought also in the Indian Home Guards. For instance, say in the Creek Nation, you had, for instance, say Sugar George / George Sugar. He was one. Pickett Renty, that was another one, who was a Creek freedman. So again, you had men fighting against the Confederates side by side, free blacks as well as your Creek or Seminoles. And also some Cherokees too, fought in the Home Guard, Cherokee freedmen. But again, the majority of the troops of Indian Territory, of what's now Indian Territory, they did fight for the South. And so at the end of the war, the South, of course, lost, and the United States sat down with tribal leaders to come up with new treaties. One of the things, of course, was that the United States wanted to end slavery throughout the territories or the contiguous borders of the United States. And so all the tribes, all 5 of the tribes agreed with that. And the Seminole and the Creek nations, with very little argument, agreed to adopt the freedmen, those blacks that had not already been adopted in the tribe. So that is what happened. As I said, without a lot of disagreement. What the Creek Nation did is that they set up 3 freedmen tribal towns. the way that and I know there's others in here that have talked more about Creek, that are really talking more into Creek culture. But of course, as most of the folks on here know, in the Creek Nation, the historic, your historic political unit was your tribal town. Eufaula, which of course these were actually tribes. Eufaula was actually a tribe. Yuchi was a tribe. Coweta was a tribe. So there was a confederacy. So you got your 3 freedmen tribal towns: North Fork, Canadian colored. In your Seminole Nation, what they did was, of course, the Seminole Nation had various different bands. And I don't know that the bands are the same names as they used to be, but of course the Eufaula Band and Tallahassee Band, some of these others. Well, what the Seminole people decided to do was that they would set up separate bands for the freedmen people. At that time, I think one of them was a Jim Lane band. That, to my understanding, that later became the Caesar Bruner band, which is the band that the freedmen people are in now. One of the 2 bands. Then there's a Doser Barker band, which is the other freedmen band. Caesar Bruner and Doser Barker were freedmen leaders prior to the 20th century. And so that is why the freedmen bands of the Seminole Nation were received those names. Now, there were some people that, and you were talking about the allotments. Now, there were some people who were put down as freedmen that were not in freedmen bands. But of course, the United States had its own reason for how they set up the Dawes rolls and the allotments and who would be a freedman. And so again, that was all, a lot of it had to deal with land scams and land grabs, which is the whole reason for the allotment anyway.
So let's kind of revisit the relationship between the Freedmen and the Creek people or Seminole people around the time of the Dawes Roll.
Okay. Well, after the Civil War, things were really good for the free blacks who had been freed by the treaty, or maybe had already were living as free people in the Seminole and the Creek Nation. Things were better. The people were being educated, the blacks, under tribal law, with tribal monies. People were holding important positions, not just as leaders in the freedmen bands, but there were tribal attorneys, light horsemen, other important positions were being held. And but the bad thing, of course, was that white people were pouring into the 5 tribes, more so, of course, into the Creek Nation than the Seminole Nation, because the Creek Nation had much more land per the treaty, so far as the boundaries. The United States began to put the pressure on after the Civil War, and the tribes had been successful in pushing this back. And not just the tribal leaders, but also the people from full blood, mixed blood, freedmen, whatever adopted class that there was in the tribes. Everybody was opposed to it. And of course, the blacks in the Creek and the Seminole Nation, they were hearing horror stories from blacks coming from the deep South of lynchings and black codes and discrimination, and they didn't want any part of this if there was going to be a state. And of course, the allotment would be tied into statehood. Well, eventually, the United States was able to pretty much force the tribes to negotiate allotment agreements, and which they did in the in the late 1890s, early 1900s. The Dawes Commission, so again, there was a lot of opposition. People have heard of Chitto Joe, who fought against the allotment, and there were freedmen that fought with him that were very opposed to allotments. Again, people, they wanted to stand with the 1866 treaties. Again, these were the same treaties that where the tribes in the United States agreed that the Freedmen, the Seminole, and the Creek Nation would have permanent citizenship and equal rights in the tribes. So, against the will of the people, the Dawes Commission, they came in and they began to make these Dawes rolls. And these were allotment rolls. Basically, in the Seminole and the Creek Nation, the agreements that were signed between those tribes in the United States said that each member of the tribe would get about 160 acres of land. And it didn't matter whether or not the person was 100 years old. It didn't matter if the person was a baby. It didn't matter if you were a freedman, a full blood, if you were from Coweta or North Fork. It didn't matter if you were, or in the Seminole Nation, if you were in one of the Freedmen bands or the Tallahassee band or Eufaula band, whatever, Mvskoke. Didn't matter. So they came through, and the advantage to the United States to put people down as a freedman was that the United States passed a law that if you were a freedman, your land would be unrestricted starting in 1904. So that meant it would be sellable. So basically what happened is that those people that were put down as freedmen were, a lot of whites came in, filed false claims, filed false deeds, and just stole the people's land. People that had quote-unquote lower blood quantums, less than a half, their land became unrestricted starting in 1908. So as I said, there was a difference in a lot of these issues with the freedmen, with putting people down as freedmen. Because again, if you look back at your historic tribal rolls, people were nobody had some, if you, for instance, say you look at rolls made by the tribe in earlier years, you don't have people marked down there as with the word freedman. That was a name that was a term that was alien to the people of the Creek and the Seminole Nation. The Dawes Commission, what they did in the Creek Nation is they said if they or a parent was on the J.W. Dunn roll, which is a payment roll made just shortly after the Civil War, they generally put you down as a freedman. Now, not in all cases, but that was generally the case what they did. In the Seminole Nation, they pretty much went with who was a member, who was in one of the Freedmen bands to put the person down. And usually they went by your mother. One of the things that happened, of course, with a lot of freedmen is because people didn't live as long. A person may have had a parent who was quote unquote in Indian, didn't have any African ancestry, maybe who was a member of one of the non-freedmen tribal towns or bands, but that person may have died prior to whatever date the Dawes Commission put out there. For instance, say 1899 was the date in the Creek Nation, according to the agreement between the Creek Nation and the United States. So you had some cases, for instance, say of, I'll just give you an example, John Jefferson. He was a person that was listed as a freedman, but he had a brother, a full brother, Silas Jefferson, who was I believe he was a town king. And he was put down as one half Mvskoke. He was put on the by-blood roll. So you have a lot of such cases. The bad thing, of course, was a person like John Jefferson, because he wasn't a young man, and their parents were already deceased. His his children don't have an ancestor on the by-blood roll, which affects their enrollment rights in the future, based on the current law. But at the time of the Dawes enrollment, as I said, everybody in the Creek Nation or the Seminole Nation got an equal equivalent of land. If the land was a little better, you got less than 160. If the land was a little worse, you got more than 160. But those rolls were supposed to be made for allotment purposes, not to later be used to throw people out of the tribe, or to have some tribal members look down on one person or another based on what number was put down there for land restriction purposes, or when the land would become unrestricted. Nobody would ever have dreamed back in 1900 or 1905 that would be the result of making those rolls.
So Marilyn, let's pick back up around statehood. What happened from here?
Well, things pretty much went downhill in the Creek and the Seminole Nations. Not just for the not just for its black citizens, but for everybody. At Oklahoma statehood, the tribal governments were pretty much abolished. You started having appointed chiefs. The bands, the tribal towns still had a right to meet, but like in the Creek Nation, there was, the majority of towns just didn't meet, including, after a certain amount of time. I believe in the Seminole Nation that the bands still continued to meet, including the Freedmen bands, and the people still continued their tribal identities better. Now, the worst thing that happened to the Freedmen citizens of the Creek Nation and the Seminole Nation was that what became Oklahoma, what's now Oklahoma, the people that were coming in on these land runs were mostly people coming from the Deep South. You got a lot of people coming from Mississippi, Alabama, or the like, that were very racist, and they wanted to put blacks, quote unquote, in their place. And so the first laws that were passed when Oklahoma became a state were laws that defined Negroes as people with one drop of African descent. And then they began to pass these discriminatory laws that people of African descent had to go to segregated schools, live in segregated communities, excuse me, on and on and on. Couldn't marry with other people. So all of a sudden here, people couldn't marry with the majority of people in their own tribe. And so then you had people that didn't have African descent that were members, say, of the Creek Nation or the Seminole Nation. Certainly the older people remembered those ties and remembered how everybody had fought in the Indian home guards together, shoulder to shoulder. But some of the younger people growing up, they were not around the other people in the tribe that had African ancestry. They weren't going to the same schools anymore. And because this pressure was coming from whites that if you want to amount to something, if you want to move forward in the state of Oklahoma, have political power, you're not going to be associating here with your Negro relatives that live down there across the railroad tracks, or your Negro friends that you used to sit on the council with down here at the council house. And so, again, this pressure from whites and people began to get moving further and further away from traditional values. And now it's more about political power and moving up in the corporate world or whatever. So there starts to be hostility, kind of like, well, you can hold me back. We need to, I'm trying to hide the fact that I've got a black grandma myself. So these were the kind of attitudes that were coming into the Creek Nation, coming into the Seminole Nation. And so eventually it got to the place where when the tribes began to win some judgment funds, they began to push against the United States, sharing the money with the Freedmen tribal members. This didn't just begin, in the 1980s or the 1990s. These sort of mentalities actually started happening in the 1930s, the 1940s. And again, as I said, this was a Jim Crow state. There were not lynchings in 1880 and 1890 in the Creek in the Seminole Nation, but after and that's not to say that there were no quote unquote Indians that were lynched here, but the biggest share of people that became to physical harm, due to racist activity, were people of African descent in the state of Oklahoma. I think there's no question about that. And so as I said, you had people moving away from traditional values because they want to move up in the white world, people who didn't have African descent. And then you have the people of African descent. Now they're being forced to go to school with some of the blacks that came in here on some land runs and the like. And people who have no tribal values, have no tribal knowledge, and the people are starting, not immediately, but they're starting to intermarry with some of those people. And so that also began to fray into some bonds. And so, as everybody is going to schools and learning English, and people are just getting away from that tribal unity. It wasn't like in later years, in current years, where there are programs for people to learn their language, a lot of books, and so you get older people who they're not teaching their children, and I'm talking about including Freedmen people. They're not teaching their children the Creek language, the Mvskoke language. And so people are moving away. People are moving away from traditional religion. Whereas, freedmen used to be members to worship at grounds. People, just like others, began to move closer to the churches. Churches, you have a lot of ministers, not 100%, that began to criticize the old ways, the old faith. Talking about heathenism. You go out there and you touch that medicine, that's devil worship. They would tell people that. And so as I said, people began to move away from traditional ways, traditional religion. And also, because of Jim Crow and some people, trying to put as much distance as they could against people of African descent. There maybe have been some people who went that clearly looked of African descent that maybe, went to their old ground, or maybe their parents' old ground. Maybe they were turned away, or maybe, and so people began to feel less welcome. There was less unity. As I said, when it started coming down to sharing money, when there were some judgment funds, some began to take the position, well, we don't want to share. We don't want to share with the freedmen. If they don't get a share of this judgment fund that the whole tribe has won, then there'll be less. There'll be more for us. So that attitude, that Stahiki attitude, greed. It became more and more and more at front and center in the head, in people's heads, and so you eventually come to the days of in the 1960s, in the early 1970s, where there begins to be less discrimination against people of color. And, so once you start having your Civil Rights Act, your Voting Rights Act, it's kind of like, well, wait a minute here. If the United States is still appointing chiefs of the 5 tribes, that's not right. That's discriminatory. We're not being fair to these Indian people. So Congress passed laws, the Principal Chiefs Act. So everybody was supposed to be able to vote on a chief. And so then, so I believe everybody was, well, not necessarily in the Choctaw or the Chickasaw nations, but in the other 3 tribes, people were voting. It looked like there was a hope for some unity. But in the Creek Nation, starting like about 1975, they started trying to stop the Freedmen tribal members from voting in the 1979 Constitution. The Freedmen people weren't allowed to vote on that. And so a constitution was passed that basically removed the Freedmen people, removed them against their will. And the United States could have stepped in, but they didn't. And the Seminole Nation, the Constitution that was passed, I believe it was 1969, it included freedmen, but there became more pressure on the freedmen as time went on. And a lot of that dealt with the money or services. This attitude of, well, if they get services, there will be less for us. And so the tribal membership cards were changed. And when the Freedmen people sued over a judgment fund, the tribal leadership took the position of, well, we'll just solve this problem. We'll just vote them out. And which the tribe was not successful ultimately with, because the United States did step in when the tribe sued the United States when federal funds were cut off. So the situation is this. The Seminole Freedmen people, although they are still members of the tribe, their leadership still sits on the council. They are denied services as members / citizens of a federally recognized tribe. This is, which to me is about the same as the, those states in New Mexico, Arizona, Utah, which denied Indian people, Navajos, or people of Pueblos from voting or other public services. Well, Indians don't pay taxes, so they don't need first-class rights. In the Creek Nation, where the people have been put out completely, this is akin to places like South Africa or the like, who colonialized people, enslaved people. And it's kind of like, well, we're a sovereign nation. We can treat people however we want to. Now, when the United States broke treaties, when the United States took land, didn't pay, whatever, everybody said that's wrong. But at least the United States' official position is that people of color, people who have been enslaved, people who have been colonialized here, they do have citizenship rights. They have the right to vote. They have the right to public services. That's the least that we can do for them. But you have some tribal leaders that they don't see that when it comes to the Freedmen people. And, even though they want the United States to toe the line, to do what the United States has said. They want for themselves to have first-class opportunities as United States citizens, but yet they think that the Creek Nation or the Seminole Nation or some of the other tribes should not live up to their obligations, their agreements so far as how the Freedmen people would be treated.
So Marilyn, we've talked about pre-removal, we've talked about post-removal and statehood. Let's kind of talk about the current state of the Freedmen.
Well, the current state of the Freedmen in the Creek and the Seminole Nation is not that good. Again, here we are, the 21st century. So you have discrimination, you have denationalism, second-class citizenship going on right in Indian country, in the true tribes. And there's various reasons for this discrimination. With your Creek Nation, the Freedmen were thrown out in part to stop them from receiving a judgment fund. That is, it came down to the money. Another reason is the voting issues, voting power. In the Creek Nation, on the Dawes rolls, about a third of the people were put down as freedmen. Now, probably a third of the people right now, if they were to register freedmen right now, I would say there would be less than a third, because some of those people listed as freedmen were married to people who were citizens by blood at that time, or at a later point in time, they married citizens by blood, either in the Creek Nation or another tribe. But let's say 25% of those people, the descendants, don't have an ancestor except for a freedman ancestor. Well, the freedmen historically have always been very heavy voters. It was something very important to them. And so to some leaders, it's kind of like, if these people vote and they all come in and vote, are we going to be able to control that vote? Because the bottom line is millions, billions of dollars are coming, say, in the Creek Nation. And who's going to control that money? Who's going to control those big, powerful jobs, those big contracts? Well, if you can vote, or if you control a voting block, you may have a lot of say-so in who's going to get into office. And just going back a little bit here, in the Seminole Nation, where the people are still voting, that are freedmen, but they're being discriminated against with their services, the freedmen people during the 30s, during the 40s, during the 50s, they took their voting very, very seriously, where some of the people in the other bands didn't vote that much. And so what was going on in the Seminole Nation was that even though there was an appointed chief, the people would select a chief and ask the United States government to approve that person. And so a lot of the elections, the majority of people voting were freedmen. Even though the freedmen, if you look at the Dawes roll, maybe they were 15% of the tribe. But if the freedmen people are 70% of the voters, they could basically select the chief, or had big sway on who would be the chief. And so nowadays you have people that, because there's so much money, they want to have a lot of people, a lot of freedmen voting. So you have moratoriums going on where sometimes years will go by before they'll process freedmen people tribal membership applications. And a lot of people, they get discouraged when maybe they see they're not eligible for services, or maybe they see that their cousin over here that's a member of one of the quote-unquote by-blood bands, that they get their application processed, and they're voting, and they're registered to vote in less than a month, but they've been waiting 4 or 5 years for theirs. and some people just say, oh, I'm not going to fool with this. It's not really that important. But again, you have some tribal leaders that is what they want. They want people to get discouraged because they want to control who's going to vote. Because again, it comes into the power and the money that's come into play after the Indian Self-Determination Act of 1975, when tribes began to get federal grants, be able to run programs. And then, of course, with the casinos coming in, there's been a lot of money that nobody dreamed would have been there 30 years ago. It's great that there has been money to do some things, but it's not been good that it's also caused some disunity. You have people out here who their whole identity is the number on their CDIB card. Never mind that 50 years ago there wasn't a CDIB card. 60 years ago, 100 years ago, or 150 years ago, the idea that somebody, their whole identity of being a Creek or being or a Seminole or being a Mvskoke was some number on a white man's card would have been crazy. Well, what do you mean? That's why you're one? Or somebody looking down on somebody else based on their number on this white man's card? It just wouldn't make sense to someone. So like I said, you have that disunity, and I think that was part of the whole reason for the blood quantum ideas to separate the tribes by who had a blood quantum or how much there was a blood quantum. Wasn't just to make it easier to steal from some, but also to get people to fight. Because now you have people who feel that some that were historic tribal members, they shouldn't be there because they can't get a CDIB card based on current government regulations. Well, what if the federal government tomorrow said, well, we're only going to issue a CDIB card to people who are half-blood or higher right now because nobody else has restricted land? Well, if the CDIB, would somebody not be a Mvskoke because the government came and collected their card? I don't know. Makes you wonder. So, as I said, the voting, the money sharing, you have a lot of people walking around with a lot of misunderstanding of who the Freedmen are. They don't know a lot of people don't know the history of the Mvskoke people. They know they have a card. I think they understand that their grandmother or a great grandmother or somebody spoke Creek, but a lot of people they're not tuned into the nation. Too many people only see the nations as a source of benefits, as a piggy bank, and some they don't want to learn. There have been language, culture classes here and there, and sometimes the people don't want to come because they're not interested. Look, even right now, you look at the small number of people that are participating in the political processes of the Creek and the Mvskoke nations. If you look at the total enrollment versus the number of people that voted, those are public records. They're up there on the internet. They're up there on Facebook. It kind of tells you a lot of apathy that is there. So, like I said, that ties into a lack of knowledge of people, of the history. You have people who you have some people that are opposed to the Freedmen because, they just don't like black people. There are some people that, depending on what they look like, or maybe their parents look like, that are, say, members of the Mvskoke Nation, Maybe they've never really faced discrimination based on their appearance. Maybe their parents have. Maybe it's hard for them to conceptualize it. I'm not going to mention the names of any particular people that come to mind, but there are some people that I pretty much guarantee that they've never faced a day of being discriminated against, because, I'm talking about, say, some blue-eyed blonde creeks, whatever, and I have no problem with how such a person looks. But again, they have no sympathy for people who've been discriminated against. They have some people, they maintain stereotypes against people of African descent. Never mind that there's a lot of white people out here who have stereotypes against people of Indian descent. I mean, there's white people out there that'll swear up and down 90% of all Indians are drunks or on welfare or whatever. Never mind that, any thinking person can surely see better than that. But as I said, there's people out there that it benefits them to keep those stereotypes going. And so, and you've had, and unfortunately, you've had some tribal leaders that instead of trying to bring the tribes together, to bring the people together, they have tried to manipulate the, people. And I just, for instance, there was a tribal leader that was going to different communities in the Creek Nation, telling people that Freedmen people snuck into the tribe on land runs, squatted on land, and the federal government just gave it to them. Now, anybody that does any kind of historical research can see that that's a lie. I mean, if you can read the treaties, you can look at the 1860 slave schedules that they had for Indian Territory. You can look at look at different roles, also different things about Indian blood. I mentioned a little bit about, for instance, say the Jefferson family. There's a lot of people out there, as I said, that can trace their Indian descent, who were listed as freedmen, or their parents or their grandparents were. I think when you're talking about the 1971 Creek Judgment Fund, it's specifically the Act of Congress. It specifically talked about Creek freedmen who could trace back to the 1857 Old Settler Roll, being eligible for the payment. So as I said, there is a lot of proof that a big percentage of the Freedmen people of the Creek and Mvskoke, the Creek Nation and the Seminole Nation can prove their ancestry back to a specific Indian who was listed on some tribal roll or census. But as I said, there's a lot of ignorance out there. So where do we go from here? Well, it's hard to say. Unfortunately, it looks like things don't get better for freedmen people unless the federal government steps in, dealing with some kind of pressure, whether it's money or services or the like, to get tribal leaders to see things a different way, that they need to honor the treaties. You have some tribal leaders or former tribal leaders who want to refer to freedmen people as African Americans. Well, the freedmen people didn't become U.S. citizens until the same act of Congress, until an act of Congress was passed in 1901 that gave citizenship to members of the 5 tribes. So that freedman, that was, say, John Jefferson in the Creek Nation, who went on the Dawes roll. He received his U.S. citizenship the same day as G.W. Grayson. who was a chief of the Creek Nation at one point in time. So the thing is, the freedmen of the tribes, we have a history that is different than the black people who say were descendants of slaves or free blacks that were living in Louisiana or other places in the South. They don't have I would say for the most part, they definitely don't have a tribal background, a tribal history, ties to specific tribes where the freedmen people do. So our rights are based on the treaties of 1866, the same ones that the Creek Nation or the Seminole Nation use when they are suing over their boundaries or riverbed rights or other things. You know, that's what the nations stand on. So for some reason, those treaties are good enough, you know, when it comes to money making and the land base and putting land in trust and that sort of thing. But somehow they're not good enough when it comes to the freedmen people, the people who helped the tribe survive during the darkest, hardest days of the tribe. So I can't say what's going to happen. I would like to hope that through education, the people of the Mvskoke Creek Nation and the people of the Seminole Nation of Oklahoma will say, you know, we need to honor the treaty. We need to do right by our freedmen friends, our cousins that are freedmen, and bring them back to our rightful place. We don't need the federal government to sue us or to shut us down or anything like this. This is something that we can do as a people. That's what I would like to see is an internal solution. But I will say this, our freedmen people, we do want our rights. We do want to be, we want the rights that our forefathers were promised. Our ancestors stayed in the tribes, built them up, and we didn't abandon the tribes. And so now you have some tribal leaders, some people that want to abandon the freedmen. It's like they want the freedmen people to have tests that others in the tribe don't have. If others can live outside the Creek Nation and be a Creek citizen, well, the freedmen should be able to do that too. If others don't speak the Creek language and they're members of the tribe, the freedmen shouldn't have to. I would like to see the freedmen being welcomed to language classes or history classes or cultural classes. I've really been heartened by the fact that, some of the cultural opportunities, it's been made clear that that's not restricted to citizens by blood of the tribes, of the Mvskoke Nation or the Seminole Nation, or a specific blood quantum or something like this. And I think that's just great. So it's kind of like, I'm not sure what's going to happen. But the best thing, as I said, would be for internal solutions, because if not, the freedmen people will look to external solutions. Because the freedmen people, this is our history, our cultural heritage, our bloodlines too.
So Marilyn, we appreciate you joining us today on Red Stick Warrior Talks. Let the people know how they can reach you or your organization.
Okay. Well, the Descendants of Freedmen Association, we have a Facebook page, Descendants of Freedmen 5 Tribes. It's an open page, and anybody can go in there and see an announcement or something of when we're having a meeting, or sometimes we have some a historical post or whatever is going on there. That's not specific, of course, to the Seminole and Creek Nation, but As I said, when we find things happening, we try to put them up there. Also, we have a website. It's not up to date, but www.freedman.org. That will, you can go there, and also you can contact us through the website. You can also contact us through this number, 405-227-9810, and that will go to a voicemail. And we have meetings that we usually put up on, we announce on Facebook. Sometimes they're put up, sometimes they're announced to the newspapers, just depending on where they are. And we welcome everybody. When we usually, most of our meetings are open to the general public. It doesn't cost anything to go, but usually there are, we let folks know kind of what's going on with the tribes. And also sometimes there's historical or language lessons or the like that are there, cultural lessons. And so we welcome you. We're going to have one in Oklahoma City and at the last Saturday in January, Faith Memorial Baptist Church. We're trying to do things to bring unity to the tribal nations of the 5 nations. So this is a great day.
All right, thank you so much, Marilyn.
Mado.
Mado.